Please, may I request you to take your seats and let's get started. We are almost 10 minutes behind and we have like 7 presentations to go through in a very short period of time. Our 7 speakers will take us through the range of diversities that is really at the heart of planetary health. It's not just the diversities, but it is the range of issues that are concerned with this field, but more importantly, the interconnectedness of these issues that is at the core of planetary health. I think we've talked about the issues around transdisciplinary approach to research, and for work in this area, this is really what it will take. So we will have about 7 different presentations, and I will call the people to come in and give us their 4 minutes presentation. I want to invite you to really think deeply as you're listening to these various presentations around these diversities of issues that we are grappling with, the magnitude of these challenges, but more importantly, the opportunities that we have to significantly affect these conversations at various levels. So as you're listening through these, we will have some time at the end for conversation, for questions and answers. And I do invite you to take notes and be able to come up with your questions at the end. As I look through the 7 presentations that we have, we really are seeing people from various different disciplines. We have engineers, we have agricultural scientists, we have economists, we have, of course, demographers and public health and epidemiology, but more importantly, other sciences that are really crucial to understanding the challenges we face with the way our action is affecting the Earth systems, and the way the Earth systems are also affecting our health and well-being as humanity. I believe Richard Houghton talks about this as really the challenge of our civilization, whether we move forward, whether we make progress as humanity. And this is where we are. And I really am excited about this session, and I would want to call our first speaker, Professor Duncan Thomas, who will look at how natural disasters influence child growth trajectories, which has been established to really affect not just health outcomes, but also human capital development and socioeconomic opportunities and outcomes for individuals. So, Duncan, you're next.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for allowing me to present at this conference. It's been an absolutely fantastic experience. I want to talk about part of a very large project, which is joint with Elizabeth Frankenberg, who directs the project, along with me, which is about the impact of a large-scale natural disaster on health and well-being, very broadly defined, of an entire population. Today, I'm going to report on results on a specific outcome, child height trajectories. So the natural disaster we'll talk about is a 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami. The earthquake occurred on December 26, 2004. It registered as a 9.3 on the Richter scale, among the largest earthquakes ever recorded, and shifted the North Pole by several centimeters. The effect of the tsunami was felt right across the Indian Ocean, but the impact was greatest on Aceh, Indonesia, which is on the northern tip of the island of Sumatra in Indonesia, and 5% of the population of the entire province was killed by the tsunami. 15% of the population was displaced, and there was widespread destruction. However, there were also some people who were largely protected because, of course, if you were in a promontory that was not directly affected, or if you were higher up, then you were protected and arguably not necessarily as negatively impacted, in some cases positively affected. Importantly, this tsunami, which was so devastating, was followed by a very large reconstruction program. Initially, the government and NGOs tried to get food and shelter to the people, but after a couple of years, there was a rebuilding and so-called building back better, which has been shown to have been extremely successful. And I want to examine what happened after this, what was the impact of this large-scale unanticipated shock immediately or in the short term on child height, and then afterwards as they went through the subsequent reconstruction. And I'm going to focus on those children who were in utero at the time of the tsunami in order to pick out the impacts of that exposure. The data we're going to use are called the Study for the Tsunami Aftermath and Recovery, and it's data that we collected. The baseline survey was actually conducted 10 months before the tsunami on a large population representative sample of about 27,000 people who were living along the coastal Kabupaten of Aceh and North Sumatra. We did follow-ups of all the survivors and annually followed them up for 5 years, and those are the data that I will speak to today. We followed them again after 10 years, and we're currently doing some more work with funding from Wellcome Trust to look at metabolic dysregulation. We have interviewed, at least once, 98% of the survivors of the tsunami, even though many of them scattered all over not only Aceh but other parts of Indonesia. We work with the most incredible collaborators, the Survey Meter in Indonesia. And the data that I'm going to use for today's presentation are child height for age that we measured 2, 3, 4, and 5 years after the tsunami. And I'm going to show you two results: child height for age Z-scores in, so that they're internationally comparable with the WHO standards, and they're going to be stratified by the trimester in which the child was in at the time of the tsunami, to the best of our estimate. So there are three bars there. The second trimester in the middle are the kids who are the most affected the most, all kids who have a negative impact. Their height was lower than the comparison peer group that we're using, who were not directly affected. And the negative impact was very large and significant. It's over half a standard deviation in height for these children. However, as the reconstruction program developed and over time, all of these children grew much faster than their peers. And as you can see, by 5 years on, these children have not only recovered these deficits, but they actually now were even taller than their peers, significantly so for all three cohorts. And so these deficits have not only been made up, but these children have grown up to almost a standard deviation in height faster than the children who were not exposed to the tsunami. Not everybody benefited from the reconstruction equally, and I've shown you here with the purple and grey slides. These are children who were are exposed to very high levels of maternal stress, and they did not grow. So to conclude, in utero exposures did have a negative impact, but these negative impacts are not long-lasting, and they probably reflect both environmental and stress impacts. The catch-up growth is dramatic, and that apparently there is no, to conclude that having a negative disaster results in your being short for life is just not true. There is scope for catch-up growth that is substantial. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Duncan. Our next presentation is by Noriko Endo, who will be speaking to us about climate change and one of the unfinished agendas, health agendas in Africa, malaria.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Noriko Endo from MIT. We are dealing with the issue of malaria transmission from the scope of environmental engineering. As many of you already know, malaria is a disease of humans caused by Plasmodium parasite transmitted by Anopheles mosquitoes. There are many ways of dealing with malaria transmission, but you shouldn't forget environment also influences malaria transmission. For example, climate and temperature influence adult mosquitoes' lifespan and also the development rate of parasite. The availability of water also influences malaria through the abundance of vector pools and the living patterns of humans. Climate also influences the availability of water through rainfall. The title of today's presentation is Climate Change Impact on Malaria in Africa, so I'd like to focus on this system. The first message from me is that the environmental impact on malaria is really complex and nonlinear, so a simple correlation analysis may not be enough to analyze the environmental impact. So for rigorous analysis, you need a mechanistic approach. You need to analyze based on the principles of physics and biology. And one way to realize that is through simulation models. Our group has been developing a mechanistic malaria model, HydroMats, hydrology, entomology, and malaria transmission simulator. HydroMath is a comprehensive and detailed model which features the explicit representation of water bodies and the behaviors of Anopheles mosquitoes. This model has been tested extensively against multitudinous observational data from East and West Africa. Another challenge of analyzing the environmental impact or climate impact on malaria is simply that we do not know the future climate. There are many GCM, global climate models, but they often disagree on each other, which implies that some models are more accurate than others. So we select the most accurate GCM for our target site based on their ability to reproduce the observed climate. For some regions, we seek even more accurate projection of climate using RCM, Regional Climate Model, through the process called dynamic downscaling. So, it looks terrible, sorry. So by applying the accurate projection of climate to the mechanistic malaria model, we analyze the climate change impact of malaria in these 3 regions in Africa. Sorry, the figure is not very clear. Okay, anyways. So the future risk of malaria is expected to be high over this region in Africa, which may not be very clear, but I'm pointing out this like Ethiopian highland. In this region, the future climate is expected to be warmer and slightly wetter. And this region currently have temperatures significantly lower than the optimum temperature for malaria transmission. So the increase in temperature leads to higher transmission of malaria. Furthermore, the people here are currently living at low endemicity of malaria due to cold temperature. So people are currently living with low immunity or limited immunity. So the combination of higher transmission potential in the future and the current low immunity conclude high risk of malaria in this region in the future. Over the coastal Sahel fringe, the future climate is likely to be warmer and drier. Unlike the Ethiopian highland, the warmer climate leads to lower transmission potential because the temperature here is already close to the optimum temperature for malaria transmission. Furthermore, drier climate leads to lower transmission potential too, so the overall risk of malaria will be low for this field. Over the Sahel fringe in West Africa, the climate impact is mixed. This region expects warmer and wetter climate. Similar to the previous site, the warmer climate makes malaria transmission less likely, but wetter climate more likely. So the impact is a little bit ambiguous. However, given the current level of people's immunity, the moderate level of current immunity, we do not expect the future risk of malaria increase significantly. In conclusion, based on the mechanistic malaria model and the accurate projection of future climate, we found different mechanisms are driving distinct patterns in the change in malaria transmission over Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Noriko. So our next presenter will speak about mainstreaming agricultural biodiversity to secure sustainable and nutritious food systems globally. And it's my pleasure to welcome Anne Totwala to speak to us.
So thank you very much. I appreciate being here. For those of you who don't know Bioversity, we are an international research for development institution. And our vision for our society is that agricultural biodiversity nourishes people and the planet, which we came up with before the Planetary Health Alliance was created. So first of all, what is agricultural biodiversity? It is the variety and the variability of animals, plants, and microorganisms used directly or indirectly to produce food. So because of my 4 minutes and because we all, I think, have discussed and understand the links between our diet and health, we understand the links between our diet and planetary boundaries, and we understand that our system is not producing the kinds of foods that we want for our nutrition. And we also understand that if we can change our diets, we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So the bar chart on the right-hand side, indicates that if we just transition to a global equivalent of a Mediterranean diet, by 2050 we will reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture by 25% over sort of a business-as-usual, income-driven diet. Similarly, we have studies that are demonstrating that there's a strong link between increasing agricultural biodiversity and lower rates of stunting. So what I'd like to do is to talk about 3 specific examples where biodiversity has been working to address reintroducing or integrating agricultural biodiversity into food systems. So the first is an example from Brazil, where we have been working on a Jeff-funded project. In Brazil, Brazil accounts for about 18% of the world's plant biodiversity, yet almost the entire diet is based on exogenous foods. So what we've been doing with the Brazilian government, Brazilian researchers, is identifying about 70 highly nutritious but neglected species and conducting nutritional analyses on those species. So one example is this one here, which has about 38 times the vitamin C of an orange per 100 grams. When I presented this to a Brazilian, he said, "I don't even know that fruit." The project has not only included filling these knowledge gaps about the nutrition of these 73 species and integrating that information into the FAO in-foods database. We've also been working with the Brazilian government to develop new dietary guidelines that integrate these kinds of fruits and vegetables into the dietary guidelines. In addition, we've been working with the Brazilian government, who has just passed a law basically requiring that school feeding programs and other institutional feeding programs incorporate these indigenous crops into their food systems. So we've been doing similar work. I'm going to skip this and go right to this, so I can come back to India and the questions. So the last thing, we have been working at a systemic level to create an agricultural biodiversity index, which will measure both the status and the policies and regulations on ag biodiversity across consumption, production, seed systems, and conservation systems. And the goal is to incentivize both the public and the private sector to invest more in the public sector and in private sector value chains. We're developing the prototype for this index now with 4 countries and 4 private sector companies. And in a couple of months, we will be producing a book which details the evidence for how agricultural biodiversity improves diet and resilience. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. So we'll move right on, and we will be hearing about the implications of seasonal and climate factors on the risk of measles. And Jessica Metcalf will be speaking to us on that. Let's welcome her with a clap, please.
Hi. So we're surprisingly seasonal animals. The way children are born all around the world, even today, and in New York from Madagascar, depends on the time of year. So more children are born in late spring in Madagascar. We're also seasonal in our behavior, and we can see the footprint of this in the transmission of directly transmitted infections, where transmission tends to be low at times of year when children are not in school. We also tend to deliver our health care in seasonal ways. Every row on this plot is a district in Madagascar, showing vaccination coverage, and the rows light up during weeks in April and October during Mother-Child Health Weeks, which happen twice a year. I'm going to talk today about measles. So measles, because of its potentially very high case fatality rate, and because we have a completely immunizing, very inexpensive vaccine, has been called a best buy in public health. Every WHO region has a measles elimination goal, as depicted by this nice Sophie Blackwell illustration. Every part of this seasonal clockwork will shape measles dynamics. Measles is a completely immunizing infection, so the only source of new susceptible individuals, the S, is births, which are seasonal, transition from susceptibility to infectiousness, is driven by transmission, and measles transmission is seasonal all over the world, often driven by school terms. In Madagascar, measles incidence is happily very low, but we can see the signature of school terms in rubella, which will have similar drivers. They're on the left. And all of this will interact with seasonality in healthcare. Madagascar is subject to devastating cyclones, which tend to disrupt access to many parts of the country. These occur around Christmas, and the timing of those health weeks is partly determined by the cyclone season. Because of the way this timing of healthcare plays out, children will move in and out of susceptibility over the course of the year. And since the age of children affects the risky outcomes associated with measles, we need to understand this. And so what we need to do is build mathematical and demographic models that can unpack how susceptibility plays out over the course of the year, given all these different drivers. And to show you how that works, so we can just plot out seasonal births on the left-hand side there, fluctuating according to the data I showed you earlier, and then we can track children forward over age as they age. And I have a very bad feeling about where this slide's going to go. Oh, well, the colors are all wrong, but what you should be seeing is that as children born in June will be the youngest children to be eligible for the April vaccination week. So eligibility window goes from 8 months to 11 months. And so at around that age, vaccination will occur. Children born early in the year will be older when they reach that window of eligibility. Wow, this is very hard to interpret. And what you should have seen on this plot was that there's a relatively straightforward fix. There's a window of children would come through susceptible just because of the way that timing of those vaccination weeks was working out and because of the age eligibility. But a simple fix is to increase the upper age of eligibility. So it's a low-cost change to the program. Although ultimately what we want to do is strengthen routine vaccination, demographic thinking can show us both this potential issue that results from the demographic drivers and the seasonal drivers, and can point to a particular solution. So with funding from the Wellcome Trust, we've been working to bring more detail to this picture. So we've been collating data across urban and rural settings on more nuanced opportunities for vaccination over the course of the year. This is work by Keithley Mensah. And we've been integrating various data sources from mobile phone call data records, which give us windows onto people's mobility, through to looking at paper records held at the health centres across the country. And this shows one lot classified by the month of birth of the children. So you can see that playing out here. And this gives us an opportunity both to digitize these important data sources, but also to interact with people who are working at this front line of measles vaccination and healthcare in Madagascar. And of course, it's very hard to anticipate the outcomes of natural disasters, as Duncan was telling us. We understand the natural history of measles so well, we can start to plan for the future. And the problem, of course, is that the future is changing. So the frequency and timing of cyclones might change, but the next set of questions will be to start working towards this. So I'd like to thank all my co-authors, many of whom are here, and the Wellcome Trust who funded some of this work.
Thank you, Jessica. Fifth presentation in this series is from Matt Smith, who will talk to us about anthropogenic CO2 emissions and global nutrient intake. Matt?
Great, thank you. So I'm a postdoc here at the Harvard School of Public Health, working with Sam Myers. And I'm going to talk about some of the work we've been doing to measure the effects of anthropogenic CO2 emissions on global nutrient intakes. So the backdrop of this is that global carbon emissions are increasing. They've been doing so for decades. And here they are shown in these black dots over time against several climate change scenarios looking at the forecasted CO2 emissions in the future. And it's unclear if you can see it, but we are currently marching along the most severe pathway, which is RCP 8.5 currently. And that's important because if we continue to do so, the global CO2 abundance is expected to hit roughly 550 parts per million by mid-century. And that number is important because under 550 parts per million, So Sam Myers published a paper a few years ago in Nature showing that several crops that we depend on for nutrition have lower nutritional content when grown under elevated CO2 when compared to ambient CO2 levels. So here are several different crops shown organized by photosynthetic group, so C3 grasses, C3 legumes, C4 grasses and tubers. And for across iron, zinc, and protein, you can see several of the combinations have a decreased nutritional content under elevated CO2 when compared with ambient, which is what's shown on the y-axis here. And this is a problem because globally our dietary supply of nutrients is dependent on CO2-affected crops. If you make very rough assumptions for bioavailability of iron, roughly 63% of bioavailable iron is derived from plants that would be affected by this, 51% of zinc, 43% of digestible protein. And moreover, the poorest countries tend to be most reliant on plants for this nutrition because they are deriving, they're consuming the least amount of animal source foods compared to the rest of the world. And currently, deficiencies for all of these nutrients are high. Roughly 1 billion people are suffering from each of these nutritional deficiencies, probably more so for iron. And so losing an additional source in the diet could exacerbate these problems. And so our approach was to take current diets, look at the different supplies of these nutrients from those diets, and reduce the amount of nutrition by that amount that you would see under a high CO2 world. And after that, identify the countries that would be at highest risk for increased deficiency under that scenario. And so here is just the top-line result from that, which shows the geographic distribution of the increased risk of deficiency across all three of those nutrients, so a combined zinc, iron, and protein deficiency. And you can see pretty heterogeneous distribution of this. The highest risk country here is India, which is at high risk across all three because of its high reliance on C3 grains for its nutrition and its high rates of malnutrition currently. But there are also hotspots in Indonesia, the Middle East, North Africa, East Africa, across all of these. And if you take just those countries that are in the top three risk categories and sum up the number of people that would be most vulnerable to the health effects from becoming deficient in these nutrients, which are mainly children under 5 and women of childbearing age that are most susceptible to the health burden, it's roughly 658 million people would fall into that category, which is 27% of the global total. So in addition to the many other health effects that we may expect under climate change, this is another one that could be added to the list that may exert a significant health burden in the future. So thank you.
Thank you, Matt. We move next to Nagla El Abadi, who will be talking to us about dietary environmental index, using it to assess nutritional quality.
Hello, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. My name is Nagla El Abadi. I'm a doctoral candidate in nutrition epidemiology at Tufts University here in Boston, where I study the fascinating but complex relationship between dietary intake and health in the context of environmental effects. In 2016, the United Nations launched its sustainability goals, noting that one of the main challenges of this era will be to not only meet the nutritional needs of a growing global population, but to do so while reducing environmental harms. Just in case you weren't aware before today, you must now be familiar with the unbalanced burden modern food production places on our planetary resources. Specifically in the U.S., 50% of available land goes to crop or pasture, and agriculture accounts for 70 to 80% of freshwater withdrawals and 17% of fossil fuel use. This is contributing to climate change, ecosystem degradation, and loss of biodiversity. And yet we aren't even healthy. Western dietary patterns fall short of nutritional recommendations and exceed limitations for unhealthy foods. In the U.S., 7 out of 10 men and 6 out of 10 women are considered overweight or obese, leading to high rates of metabolic and chronic diseases such as hypertension, diabetes, and heart disease. So the challenge we face is how to balance optimal nutrition within ecological sustainability, because a nutritionally replete diet does not guarantee low environmental impact, and a sustainable diet is not necessarily healthy. In reality, foods may have a low environmental impact but be nutrient poor, such as sugar. Or they may be resource intensive to produce but be nutritious, like dairy. To address this challenge, we developed a dietary environmental index as a tool to gauge environmental costs against nutritional quality for a wide range of foods consumed in the U.S. For environmental impact, we use data from LCAs, or life cycle assessments, which measure the environmental inputs and outputs of a product or system over its life cycle. We assessed 4 environmental indicators: land use, water depletion, marine eutrophication, and greenhouse gas emissions. And these we standardized and combined into an aggregate environmental impact score, the EIS, and mapped them to foods reported in NHANES, a nationally representative survey. We then evaluated the EIS against each food's nutrient density using the formula of the Nutrient-Rich Food Index 9.3, which scores 9 nutrients to promote and 3 nutrients to reduce. DEX is the ratio of nutrient density to environmental impact and was calculated for about 1,200 of the most commonly consumed foods reported in NHANES. A greater nutrient density or a lowered environmental impact score leads to a higher, more favorable DEX score. We found that the DEX scores for most fruit, vegetable, legume, and nut and seed food categories, over here, generally performed above the median and frequently above the 75th percentile for overall foods due to a simultaneously high NRF 9.3 and low EIS. Cereals, pasta, and other grain products range from a near 25th percentile up to around 75th percentile or above for fortified food products. And I separated out the sweet pastry categories, which also perform between 25th to 75th percentile, largely due to a low EIS from sugar and refined grain ingredients. Dairy products ranged all over, from butter at the lowest DEX score to above 75th percentile for skim milk. And meat-based dishes were generally below 25th percentile, and though they were higher slightly for poultry and egg products, and lower scores for beef and poultry. So these findings demonstrate the ability of DEX to characterize foods with respect to diet quality and harm to the environment. The goal is to next apply DEX to assess whole diets and dietary patterns. The work is still in early stages and has its limitations, especially the need for more LCA data, but I hope to better represent food variety, but I hope this will help further initiatives towards improved diet sustainability. With acknowledgments to my thesis committee for their guidance and support, and my colleagues at the Nutrition Epidemiology Department, I would also like to thank Qantas International for the LCA data that was provided, and this work is provided from, is supported through a doctoral fellowship from NIFA. Thank you.
Thank you, Nagla. Our last presentation this afternoon is from Jesse Berman, and Jesse will be talking to us about drought and the risk of hospital admissions here in the U.S. Jesse.
Well, thank you. So I'm very pleased to be here to speak about some of my exciting work that I did as a postdoctoral student, and this work was actually just recently published in the inaugural edition of the Lancet Planetary Health, so I'm really glad to be able to present it to this audience. So we looked at drought and the risk of hospital admissions here in the western U.S. among older adults. So as just a little bit of background, the UN refers to drought as the most far-reaching of all the natural disasters. And just considering U.S. examples alone, in 2011 and 2012, some of you may remember there was a drought that spanned almost 2/3 of this entire continental U.S. and affected about 150 million people across the U.S. And as we know, California just ended its 5-year extreme drought, which is now kind of a flooding scenario over there. But when we look at what research has been done on drought and health, the answer, surprisingly, is very little. And surprisingly, most of the research that does exist is from developing nations, looking at how drought impacts health, and that deals with a lot of questions such as famine and migration and livestock deaths. But when we consider developed nations, Almost the entire literature base is from Australia, and that's represented by very few studies. And here in the US and in Europe, there's almost a total absence of literature that's been done. So as a project overview, there were really a couple different parts of this. So the first one was this question of modifying a drought measure into an assessment that's useful for a health-based analysis. We then looked at the association between drought and cardiovascular, respiratory-related disease, and total deaths among the older U.S. adults, which is the Medicare population. And we looked at it for 618 counties in 22 states west of the Mississippi River for a 14-year period. And this work really represents the largest epidemiological investigation of drought and health. So the biggest question that we had was how to characterize drought for a health-based purpose. So one of the things I discovered when digging into this problem is that there's over 150 indices that measure drought, and not a single one is for a health-based outcome. Also, there's 5 broad definitions of drought. There's like agricultural drought, meteorological drought, socioeconomic drought, and how these impact health has never really been investigated. We ended up looking at the U.S. Drought Monitor, which is kind of this broader drought measure that does a good job effectively capturing all of these simultaneously. And also the U.S. Drought Monitor was used because it's a very robust approach here in the U.S. that produces weekly maps that's been stretching back, I believe, since 2000 or 1999. We reclassified drought from the U.S. Drought Monitor data into 3 broad categories. So first, defining periods where there's non-drought, periods where there's a full drought existing, as well as periods when drought is getting worse, so when drought is increasing, and we categorize that in low and high severity. We modeled this using a 2-stage Bayesian hierarchical model where we compared essentially the risk of these health outcomes during a non-drought to either a full drought or these worsening drought events. So what do we find? The results over here along the y-axis is the percent change in risk of a health outcome during drought compared to non-drought period. So we actually see here that for mortality under a high severity worsening drought, we actually see that deaths increase by 1.55%. For respiratory admissions, we found that during a full drought period, they actually decreased by about 2%. For cardiovascular admissions, results were not significant, but we can see a very strong trend of increasing risks as you go to a low severity versus high severity condition. The second main question that we answered was we looked at this effect modification of do health risks increase in counties where drought less frequently occurs. This is a common outcome that we see in other environmental exposures. And I think this is really interesting because remember how cardiovascular admissions weren't significant before? Well, as soon as we don't consider those very counties that have a lot of drought, we see the risk becomes very significant for those, as well as for mortality in these areas where drought doesn't frequently exist. So what are the major implications of this? Drought exposure does show measurable and previously unidentified adverse health effects, and this magnitude of risk increases in areas where droughts are rare exposure. Although these percentages of risk are small, with 46.2 million elderly in the U.S., variations in drought can have major public health significance. And as we know, the IPCC predicts increases in drought severity and duration under climate change. So I'd just like to have the citation here and thank my collaborators at Yale, my advisor Michelle Bell, as well as our funding sources.
Thank you. Thank you, Jesse. So we have 2 microphones on the aisles, so please line up and we'll take a couple of questions and then we'll give the panel an opportunity to respond, and then we'll see how far we'll go with the questions. Why don't we start from there, please?
Hey, thanks a lot for the talk. So actually, it was more than interesting. My question to Noriko is about the transmission potential. I think you were expecting that I'm going to ask, right? I'm just curious about the entomological parameters used to highlight the transmission potential for malaria in Africa.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll take one on either side, please. Okay.
All right. My name is Corinne. I'm a postdoc at Harvard Medical School. My question is for Jesse. Regarding the drought, do you looked on what the cause? Is it a heat shock, the temperature was too high? Is it air quality, more aerosol in the atmosphere that caused those effects that you saw?
Thanks. Please.
Thank you for the presentation. My name's Steve Louie. I'm a professor of infectious diseases at Stanford. And my question's for Nagla. It looks like when you're building this index that you're actually comparing two quite different values, a value of the environment versus a value of human nutrition. Your index says, well, I'm just going to put these together. It seems to me there are some implicit assumptions about weighting, maybe weighting about equal weighting or not. And it gets to a core issue that we face in planetary health, and that is, how much do we value ecosystems as intrinsically useful, and how much do we value human health? So I would be interested in your decisions about the values that go into thinking about how you actually construct the index.
Thanks.
Hi, Sam Myers from Harvard. So I had a question for Jesse that's very similar, but we know that if we look at patterns of temperature and precipitation, that they're extremely tightly correlated. So I guess my question is how you sort of teased out the signal between drought versus heat exposure.
Thank you. Why don't we take those for now, then give you opportunity to respond, and then we'll come back to the next round, please.
I'm going to quickly address to the first question, like which is like how we, what are the entomological parameters that we simulate? So using the hydromass mechanistic model, we can simulate pretty much everything. We can simulate the mosquito population, the size of the population, seasonality on population, and we can also simulate the malaria transmission, like the seasonality and the size too. And because we also have all the like temperature data and so on, we can also calculate bacterial capacity, R0 and so on.
Yes, so I'd be happy to answer your questions about the drought stuff. So these, the model actually looked at the risk in each individual county for daily exposures comparing drought to non-drought periods. So these models did control for daily temperature, seasonal trends, dew point temperature, as well as other declining components we know in changes of mortality over the 14-year period. So all of those factors of the temperature component were controlled for in the individual model, and these results were actually independent of those estimates. We also did a sensitivity analysis which we controlled for both PM coarse concentrations, so PM 10 minus 2.5, as well as PM 2.5 estimates, and it was also, results were highly robust to even including those in the model. In addition, one of the things is I know that we tend to think of drought as occurring during like a summer hot period, but a lot of these areas had drought during the winter season and the fall season and in different parts of the country. So these were not effects of drought exposures that only happened during summertime and like associated with heat wave type conditions.
And then to address the third question, thank you, that was very interesting. So we wanted to put the food's nutritional aspect with respect to sustainability for a few reasons, one of which is the nutritional recommendations currently in the U.S. don't account for sustainability, and sometimes there are conflicting guidelines of what should be consumed for health versus what should be promoted for the environment. So in terms of weighting them equally, you're right that we are, and I focused on the NRF 9.3 as a very good general and well-established way to characterize nutrient density of a food. So using nutrient quality as the primary function of interest to measure a food's ability to meet a body's need for energy and nutrients. But I think it would be very interesting to look at different nutrient profiles, maybe protein or lipid profiles, or certain select vitamins to address particular needs for a vulnerable population or a disease risk, and look at the foods with respect to that. But yes, in this context, everything is weighted equally.
Jesse,
I think that handled both of them.
Okay, thanks. So, please.
Hi, my name is Andy Jones. I'm at the School of Public Health at the University of Michigan. I had two real brief questions. Professor Thomas, your data were really fascinating that you were able to capture that time period. You showed us associations of mean height for Z-score across time. I'm wondering, at the margin, amongst children who were stunted by, say, 12 months, did you see the same catch-up growth? It's such a difficult thing to shift that distribution. And for Executive Director Tutwiler, the information you presented was really, really great. we know that dietary or food composition data is so poor, and the fact that you're trying to bolster it in Brazil is great, but I'm wondering, it seems like there's a lack of will to really invest in that kind of basic work of finding out what's in our food, even though it's so critical for understanding the quality of diets. I'm wondering, do you have any thoughts on how we can attract more investment for that kind of basic work? And I'm wondering if biodiversity is involved in any of that. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
I'm Lauren. I'm a student at Cornell, and I also had a question for Director Tutwiler. I was wondering how you plan to implement these changes regarding a shift to a more Mediterranean diet or a plant-based diet, and if it's being implemented more in countries that are not so culturally meat-centric, and also whether or not you've received any pushback from, for example, the U.S. and the USDA, and just kind of the big economic powers that they are.
Thank you. Please.
Thank you. My name is Cindy Hu. I'm from Harvard School of Public Health. So my question is also for Dr. Jesse Berman. Can you elaborate a little bit more on the underlying biological mechanism on drought related to mortality? And also, in addition to mortality, are there any non-fatal health consequences that we should be worried about droughts?
Okay. We'll take one more here and then we'll give
you. Yeah, my name is Giulio De Leo, Stanford University. I have a question for Anne Tutwiler, and it's an interested question, so I would like to know how, does aquaculture fit into your vision of agricultural biodiversity and especially integrated aquaculture, agriculture?
Thank you. Please, can respond. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the question. The question was the distribution of stunting changed by the exposure to the tsunami? And the answer is yes, there was more stunting. And was the growth post-tsunami such that the distribution of stunting was changed again? And the answer to that is yes. The entire distribution of height was shifted to the right for all children, and so the fraction of children who was stunted was declined very substantially as these children experienced the improved environments post-tsunami.
Is it on? Yeah. Thanks, and thanks for the 3 questions. Let me clarify on the first one about the Mediterranean diet. So because I was going so quickly, we aren't advocating the Mediterranean diet, but the characteristics of that diet in terms of the percentage of protein in the diet, the percentage of a grain-based food source, fruits and vegetables, etc., culturally appropriate, right, to different countries, different basic diets is what we're talking about. So just to clarify that. But also in terms of, I used to work for USDA, so I know whereof I speak in terms of the pressures that are coming. I mean, we're also not advocating for a plant-based diet. There is an important role for meat in our diets, and an important role for fish in our diets. And there's an imbalance. Some parts of the world eat too much, other parts don't get enough. And I think we forget that we are vastly under-consuming animal-based proteins in large parts of the developing world based on their nutritional needs. So in answer to the question on aquaculture, absolutely. Fish are animals, part of the diet, part of the production system. We at Bioversity are primarily focused on plant-based foods. It's our history. But we envision that this index that we're developing would certainly incorporate fish into the diet and fish into production systems. So maybe we can have a bilateral conversation about that. Investing in nutritional data. Data's boring. I know this is a group of scientists, but to a lot of donors, it's kind of boring stuff. And just investing in data for the sake of data, it's tough. it's tough to convince people to do. But I think that exploring the nutritional composition of these neglected foods is instrumental to getting them reintegrated or integrated into food systems. And I think that's one thing that we've shown in this work in Brazil, is that in order for us and Brazil to make the advances in incorporating these foods into nutrition systems, into the dietary guidelines, et cetera, they needed to see the nutritional scores. And so I did have one donor approach me and said, wow, nobody's doing this, really looking comprehensively at, what are the nutritional characteristics of some of these neglected crops. So, hopefully there is some interest. It's an incredibly complex thing because there's vast differences not only across species but within species. We're working on a banana that has about 1,000 times the level of vitamin A that our Chiquita banana has, but that doesn't get captured in the data. So I hope that answers questions.
Yeah, so thank you for the question. Just to recap, the question was mechanistically, how do we believe that drought biologically impacts health? And then the second question was if there are other health outcomes out there besides the ones that we looked at. So to answer your second question first, there's a number of different health outcomes that I think are really fascinating looking at between drought and health, the biggest one being the impact of drought on mental health. The studies that do exist, because drought's really no different than any other natural disaster, and we see that with hurricanes and floods and tsunamis. The mental health effects of this are enormous. And the studies that do exist from Australia have almost entirely focused on mental health outcomes, including one in PNAS that found an increase in suicide-related deaths during extreme drought events, especially among agricultural and rural populations. So that's something which, I definitely think there's a lot of room to look at here in the U.S. To answer your first question about mechanisms, that's a really big unanswered question right now. And while there isn't any good literature on it, we do have several hypotheses. Number one being the impact of drought on mental health and the stress that it causes, especially to people who rely on the environment and water sources for their livelihood. And we know that increases in stress lead to changes, cardiovascular changes in individuals. And then we think in extreme cases that can lead to, increased numbers of mortalities. For the respiratory-related disease, that outcome that we found was a little bit surprising to us, but when you consider the effect that drought has on the ecology as a whole, it can really modify things such as pollen seasons and the production of different fungal spores and other events that can trigger things like asthma attacks and COPD and exacerbate some of these respiratory-related diseases. In a study out of Europe, they showed that an extreme high heat and drought condition in Switzerland actually shrunk the hay fever season by, I think, almost 6 weeks. So it does have impacts on the ecology, and we think that could plausibly explain why we're seeing the changes in respiratory admissions that we found.
Yeah, I wanted to pose a question that I thought about last session, but I couldn't get to the mic. So we're talking about all these planetary impacts, health, human health impacts, et cetera. But one word I haven't heard often in these conversations is risk. And if you talk to the investment community, you talk to the business community, they are scared. They're scared about their supply chains. They're scared about some are scared about where their hotels are. There are definitely ways that through the language of risk that we can speak to some of the people who aren't listening when we talk about these long-term impacts of climate change and human health. And I would just encourage this group to really talk to some financial people and engage in that kind of inquiry around how do you quantify those risks so that people who have money in the game really care about it.
Any other questions? We still have some few minutes. We can take 2, 3 other questions.
Tom Clausen from Memory. A question for Dr. Duncan. This is an amazing data set you have, but you know, in the infectious disease area, and maybe nutrition too, we don't think of a lot of opportunities to catch up in stunting, you know, once kids are kind of far along. And to the best of my knowledge, you know, the tsunami event wasn't accompanied by a massive, you know, infectious disease risk. So I'm just wondering, is there a different mechanism that's associated with the stunting that you observed, and is that more likely to have the potential for catching up over a nutritional cause or an infectious disease cause?
So that's a very good question, and the issue that the literature that I think you're referring to is largely the literature when somebody has a shock after they're born. The issue here is that what we focused on was the shock in utero, and I think the shock was twofold. The shock was maternal stress, and I established that by showing you that those children who were in utero and their mothers presented with much higher levels of post-traumatic stress reactivity were the children who were the shortest around about birth, and they were the ones who did not fully catch up. But it's also the case that in the first 18 months to 2 years after the tsunami, there was a very, very low, the price of food was very high, and access to food was very limited. So I think that these mothers also had nutritional stress, and I think both nutritional deprivation and the stress would have resulted in the births being shorter than they would have otherwise been, and those are the children that have grown. We have looked at children who were already born after the tsunami, and there is some catch-up growth, but it's nowhere near as large, which is consistent with what you would predict, because there wasn't a huge amount of infectious disease, but there was still, for the kids who were very young, in the first 18 months of life, 2 years of life, there was still a nutritional shock for those children. Of course, we see nothing for the older kids, as you would expect.
Howdy, Sam Sellers, UNC Chapel Hill. So one of the growing pieces of dialogue that I've seen in the past few years in the climate change community concerns the role of gender as a moderator of vulnerability to the effects of climate change. And I wanted to ask really any of the panelists who could speak to this, how their research results varied by gender, and if they can speak to gender-related issues in their research. Jesse, you mentioned the PNAS paper from Australia on suicides, for example, and there were really significant effects among men, no significant effects among women, and I imagine that's true for a lot of other health or dietary-related consequences as well.
The last question.
Yeah, so I'm getting my question in that I didn't get last time. My name is Nancy French. I'm with the Michigan Tech Research Institute, and I had to come back because I heard that data is boring, and I can't really leave that one on the table, because my question earlier that I didn't get in is related to the fact that we've been looking at a lot of numbers and charts and statistics that are very important for us for making decisions and to move along this idea of the fact that people rely on the earth and the earth is important to people. Really, we need data to know these things, and unfortunately, our government is stepping down from that, if anything. They're not stepping up. So my question is not really a question, or I guess it's a question to everyone. If we're going to be relying on data and using it, and that's what I do, and I think what a lot of us do, how are we going to get that data paid for? And my original question really was specifically for monitoring, because we can go out and measure something now and get paid for it for a 3-year grant. But being able to do that sustainably over time, we have some very good mechanisms in place for collecting important what are called climate variables through the WMO and other. My question is, how can we help, how can this community help to make sure that sustained data monitoring can be continued for our science?
Okay, thanks. And I will add maybe 2 questions, one to Anne and one to Duncan. And one of the biggest challenges we have with traditional food systems is the lack of investment in those food systems. And whenever you have programs that promote their nutritional values, it's traditionally the source for many poor people in these countries. So when you have programs that promote their nutritional value, they quickly get out of the reach of the very poor, and they get exported outside the countries, and then creates a new challenge for these countries. And we see this across the world. You look at the Pacific Islands, and tuna is, you can't even afford it if you're there, but you get all these floods that create challenges of obesity and all that. And we've not gotten into and one of the things we've not been hearing in these circles is really global trade patterns and how they drive both changes in the environment and changes in human health and the implications they have, whether you look at Africa and anything you can think about. Basic gasoline, Nigeria, I understand, exports the best crude there is, but imports the worst diesel that cannot be sold anywhere else, with huge implications for air pollution and all that. And Duncan, with your work, one of the bigger questions is the overcompensation that you see in these children. How is it likely to affect future health trajectories of these children? You know, are you seeing increased obesity and all that? And what is really driving that? Is it the emergency response as a result of the disaster? Because whenever you have data showing disadvantage in certain populations, you're more likely to draw in interventions to respond to those. But they are short-lived and short-term in many ways. And sometimes the changes in nutritional status of these children over time, the variability you see over time, may actually have greater health implications for them down the road. I don't know what you're seeing in your population. Anne can go first.
I feel like I have to take on the data is boring comment. So I used to be the Deputy Director General for knowledge at FAO, right? And consistently, FAO got more interest and more funding for the development projects that it was doing than for the important, critical normative work it was doing. So that's the context of my comment. I think one of the important things is to demonstrate how data can help form decisions. And that's, I think, the work we were doing in Brazil and we've done in other places, is developing a body of data and saying, this is improving your ability to help your population be, more well-fed, more healthy, et cetera. So please understand that's the context. It's just not easy to get that long-term funding for the core data that we need because people take it for granted, right? And unless you can put it in a context of how is this going to help me, this government decision maker, solve a problem, it's difficult to sustain that long-term data. So I'm fully with you, but I just want to clarify that. In terms of the plant, the diet, and the fact that these products, become out of reach of the poor, it is a challenge. But I also pushed back a bit on one of my colleagues from within the CG system who said, well, eventually we want to get to a place where fruits and vegetables are affordable for the poor. But until we get to that place, we need to biofortify food. I said, well, part of the reason we're at that place is because we haven't invested in these crops that are more nutritious. I mean, the CG, the research, for example, in I think it's 2014, $240 million was spent on 3 crops. Right? $40 million was spent on the next 15 crops total. So we're neglecting to invest in those nutritious forms of food. And I don't think we can say that it's financially out of reach until we really look at how we're investing in extension and research, education.
Alex, you make an excellent point, which is that with rapid growth after birth or after the first couple of a few 18 months of life, these children who are now much taller than one would have expected may actually have deleterious consequences, present with deleterious health outcomes in adolescence or early adulthood or later on in adulthood. So first, one of the important results of our work is that we've established very clearly there is scope for catch-up growth after very large-scale negative disasters, but that may not work out so well for all these kids. And so what we're doing at the moment, we're in the field right now with support from the Wellcome Trust, collecting biomarkers which are associated with metabolic dysregulation, not just on the adults, which is of interest in of itself because one thinks that stress might result in metabolic dysregulation in several years, but also on these kids who were in utero at the time and their older siblings. And the idea is to try to understand whether exactly the mechanism that you have in mind is at play in this population. And so we're looking at the lipids, we're looking at glucose, looking at glycosylated hemoglobin, and we're also looking at inflammation, all markers of risks of diabetes, risks of heart disease, risks of strokes, which may well have be at elevated rates precisely because of this elevated rate of growth post-tsunami. And so I think it's very important for us to, even if data are boring, it's very important for us to follow these cohorts through to understand what are the long-term consequences of these major shocks, which were truly unanticipated.
Thank you. Just in the 30 seconds that I have, I just want to put one thought out there for us as a community and as a group. You know, for me, one of the things that drew me into this field is recognizing the unique challenges a place like Africa faces with respect to planetary health. As many of you are aware, if you've seen the UN projections, we're about 1 billion people, and by 2050, you're looking at about 2.4, 2.5 billion people. And by 2100, Africa will have about 4 billion people, more people in the continent than the whole world put together between 2050 and 2100. As you look at those things, we've seen over the last 20, 30 years, the massive loss of biodiversity in the land, on the continent. We've seen huge changes in land use, rapid urbanization that is definitely changing both land use and creating new challenges for the region. We've also seen that current estimates that we've maybe used up 70% of our land for cultivation and for agriculture. And so as you look at all the intersections of these challenges and you ask yourself, how do we move forward in this place? And some of the conversations that happen at the global level on climate change and the rest are not drilling down on some of these basic challenges that we face. So when you see a woman in the village asking you why they would not cut the tree that is there, the only remaining tree in her farm for firewood, you need to have a ready answer for them. I just came back from Nigeria 2 weeks ago. Growing up, I was in a village that had 3 huge forests. These places are places at night. Before you pass those places, you have to pray. And you have to run with, almost like, I believe if we kept to it, maybe we would be beating somebody like Usain Bolt in the 100-meter dash. You have to run as fast as possible to cross those places. You pass through there now, you can't find a single tree. There are houses, there are farmlands, not a single, you couldn't even remember. You need somebody to help you identify those landmarks. That is where we are. And it's not just unique in my village. It is across the entire continent in many ways. We've lost, 70% of our tropical rainforest in the last 30-plus years. And so the challenges are huge and massive. But I think there are new opportunities, and some of the research we're hearing and being able to identify the health implications of these changes could be a huge entry point for us to begin to change mindsets around what we need to do to really sustain our civilization. May we have a good, thank you for the session, and please let us prepare the presenter.